The Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain, that historic union of Scotland and Wales with England, the wealthiest and the dominant part of the country. The transformation in industry was something new in history, and it was quite unplanned. With no models to copy and no idea of what to expect, Britain had to pioneer not only in industrial technology, but also in social relations and urban living. Between 1793 and 1815, these formidable tasks were complicated by almost constant war with France. Just as France was the trailblazer in political change, Britain was the leader in economic development, and it must therefore command special attention. Although many aspects of the British Industrial Revolution are still matters for scholarly debate, it is generally agreed that the industrial changes that did occur grew out of a long process of development. Without a doubt, the expanding Atlantic economy of the 18th century served mercantilist Britain remarkably well. The colonial empire that Britain aggressively built, augmented by a strong position in Latin America and in the African slave trade, provided a growing market for British manufactured goods. Agriculture also played a central role in bringing about the Industrial Revolution in Britain. English farmers were second only to the Dutch in productivity in 1700, and they were continually adopting new methods of farming as the century went on. The result, especially before 1760, was a period of bountiful crops and low food prices. The ordinary English family did not have to spend almost everything it earned just to buy bread. Thus, the family could spend more on manufactured goods, a razor for the man or a shawl for the woman. Moreover, in the 18th century, the members of the average British family were redirecting their labor away from unpaid work for household consumption toward work for wages that they could spend on goods, a trend reflecting the increasing commercialization of the entire European economy. As manufacturing expanded to supply both foreign and British customers, the domestic market for raw materials was well positioned to meet the growing demands of manufacturers. In an age when it was much cheaper to ship goods by water than by land, no part of England was more than 50 miles from navigable water. Beginning in the 1770s, a canal-building boom greatly enhanced this natural advantage. Rivers and canals provided easy movement of England's and Wales's enormous deposits of iron and coal, resources that would be critical raw materials in Europe's early industrial age. Nor were there any tariffs within the country to hinder trade, as there were in France before 1789 and in politically fragmented Germany. Britain had a host of other assets that helped give rise to its industrial leadership. Unlike 18th century France, Britain had an effective central bank and well-developed credit markets. The monarchy and the aristocratic oligarchy, which had jointly ruled the country since 1688, spent lavishly on stylish luxuries and provided stable and predictable government. At the same time, the government let the domestic economy operate with few controls, encouraging personal initiative, technical change, and a free market. Finally, Britain had long had a large class of hired agricultural laborers, rural proletarians, whose numbers were further increased by the second great round of enclosures, the division of common lands into privately held and managed properties in the late 18th century. These rural wage earners were relatively mobile, compared to village-bound peasants in France and Western Germany, for example, and along with cottage workers, they formed a potential industrial labor force for capitalist entrepreneurs. All these factors combined to initiate the Industrial Revolution, a term first coined by odd contemporaries in the 1830s to describe the burst of major inventions and technical changes they had witnessed in certain industries. This technical revolution went hand in hand with an impressive quickening in the annual rate of industrial growth in Britain. Whereas industry had grown at only 0.7% between 1700 and 1760 before the Industrial Revolution, it grew at the much higher rate of 3% between 1801 and 1831, when industrial transformation was in full swing. The decisive quickening of growth probably came in the 1780s, after the American War of Independence, 1775 to 1783, and just before the French Revolution, 1789 to 1799. Therefore, the great economic and political revolutions that shaped the modern world occurred almost simultaneously, though they began in different countries. The Industrial Revolution was, however, a longer process than the political upheavals. It was not complete in Britain until 1850 at the earliest, and it had no real impact on continental countries until after the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. The first factories. The pressure to produce more goods for a growing market was directly related to the first decisive breakthrough of the Industrial Revolution, the creation of the world's first large factories in the British cotton textile industry. Technological innovations in the manufacture of cotton cloth led to a new system of production and social relationships. Since no other industry experienced such a rapid or complete transformation before 1830, these trailblazing developments deserve special consideration. Although the putting out system of merchant capitalism was expanding all across Europe in the 18th century, this pattern of rural industry was most fully developed in Britain. There, under the pressure of growing demand, the system's limitations began to outweigh its advantages for the first time. This was especially true in the British textile industry after about 1760. A constant shortage of thread in the textile industry focused attention on ways of improving spinning. Many a tinkering worker knew that a better spinning wheel promised rich rewards. It proved hard to spin the traditional raw materials, wool and flax, with improved machines, but cotton was different. Cotton textiles had first been imported into Britain from India by the East India Company as a rare and delicate luxury for the upper classes, and by 1760, a tiny domestic cotton industry had emerged in northern England. After many experiments over a generation, a gifted carpenter and jack-of-all-trades, James Hargreaves, invented his cotton spinning jenny about 1765. At almost the same moment, a barber-turned-manufacturer named Richard Arkwright invented, or possibly pirated, another kind of spinning machine, the water frame. These breakthroughs produced an explosion in the infant cotton textile industry in the 1780s, when it was increasing the value of its output at an unprecedented rate of about 13% each year. By 1790, the new machines were producing 10 times as much cotton yarn as had been made in 1770. Hargreaves' spinning jenny was simple, inexpensive, and hand-powered. Arkwright's water frame, however, quickly acquired a capacity of several hundred spindles and demanded more power, water power. The water frame thus required large specialized mills, factories that employed as many as 1,000 workers from the very beginning. The water frame could spin only a coarse, strong thread, which was then put out for respinning on hand-powered cottage jennies. Around 1790, an alternative technique invented by Samuel Crompton also began to require more power than the human arm could supply. After that time, all cotton spinning was gradually concentrated in factories. The first consequences of these revolutionary developments in the textile industry were more beneficial than those generally believed. Cotton goods became much cheaper, and they were increasingly bought and treasured by all classes. In the past, only the wealthy could afford the comfort and cleanliness of underwear, which was called body linen because it was made from expensive linen cloth. Now, millions of poor people who had earlier worn nothing underneath their coarse, filthy outer garments could afford to wear cotton slips and underpants, as well as cotton dresses and shirts. Families using cotton in cottage industry were freed from their constant search for adequate yarn from scattered part-time spinners, since all the thread needed could be spun in the cottage on the jenny or obtained from a nearby factory. The wages of weavers, now hard-pressed to keep up with the spinners, rose markedly until about 1792. Weavers were among the best-paid workers in England. As a result, large numbers of agricultural laborers became handloom weavers, while mechanics and capitalists sought to invent a power loom to save on labor costs. This Edmund Cartwright achieved in 1785. But the power looms of the factories worked poorly at first, and handloom weavers continued to receive good wages until at least 1800. Unfortunately, working conditions in the early cotton factories were less satisfactory than those of cottage weavers and spinners, and adult workers were reluctant to work in them. Therefore, Factory owners often turned to young children who had been abandoned by their parents and put in the care of local parishes. Parish officers often apprenticed such unfortunate foundlings to factory owners. The parish thus saved money, and the factory owners gained workers over whom they exercised almost the authority of slave owners. Apprenticed as young as 5 or 6 years of age, boy and girl workers were forced by law to labor for their masters for as many as 14 years. Housed, fed, and locked up nightly in factory dormitories, the young workers received little or no pay. Hours were appalling, commonly 13 or 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Harsh physical punishment maintained brutal discipline. To be sure, poor children typically worked long hours and frequently outside the home for brutal masters, but the wholesale coercion of orphans as factory apprentices constituted exploitation on a truly unprecedented scale. This exploitation ultimately piqued the conscience of reformers, reinforced more humanitarian attitudes toward children and their labor in the early 19th century, and resulted in laws to protect young workers. The creation of the world's first modern factories in the British cotton textile industry in the 1770s and 1780s, which grew out of the putting out system of cottage production, was a major historical development. Both symbolically and substantially, the big new cotton mills marked the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. By 1831, the largely mechanized cotton textile industry towered up above all others, accounting for fully 22% of the country's entire industrial production. The growth of the cotton textile industry might have been stunted or cut short if water from rivers and streams had remained the primary source of power for the new factories. But this did not occur. Instead, an epoch-making solution was found to the age-old problem of energy and power. Human beings have long used their tool-making abilities to construct machines that convert one form of energy into another for their own benefit. In the medieval period, people began to develop water mills to grind their grain and windmills to pump water and drain swamps. More efficient use of water and wind in the 16th and 17th centuries enabled human beings to accomplish more. Intercontinental sailing ships were a prime example. Nevertheless, even into the 18th century, society continued to rely mainly on wood for energy, and human beings and animals continued to perform most work. This dependence meant that Western civilization remained poor in energy and power. No matter how hard people worked, they could not produce very much. The shortage of energy had become particularly severe in Britain by the 18th century. Wood was in ever shorter supply, yet it remained tremendously important. It served as the primary source of heat for all homes and industries and as a basic raw material. Processed wood, charcoal, was the fuel that was mixed with iron ore in the blast furnace to produce pig iron. The iron industry's appetite for wood was enormous, and by 1740, the British iron industry was stagnating. The steam engine breakthrough. As this early energy crisis grew worse, Britain looked toward its abundant and widely scattered reserves of coal as an alternative to its vanishing wood. Coal was first used in Britain in the late Middle Ages as a source of heat. By 1640, most homes in London were heated with coal, and it was also used in industry to provide heat for making beer, glass, soap, and other products. The breakthrough came when industrialists began to use coal to produce mechanical energy and to power machinery. As more coal was produced, mines were dug deeper and deeper and were constantly filling with water. Mechanical pumps, usually powered by animals walking in circles at the surface, had to be installed. At one mine, fully 500 horses were used in pumping. Such power was expensive and bothersome. In an attempt to overcome these disadvantages, Thomas Savery in 1698 and Thomas Newcomen in 1705 invented the first primitive steam engines. Both engines burned coal to produce steam, which was then used to operate a pump. Although both models were extremely inefficient, by the early 1770s, many of the Savery engines and hundreds of the Newcomen engines were operating successfully in English and Scottish mines. In the early 1760s, a gifted young Scot named James Watt, 1736 to 1819, was drawn to a critical study of the steam engine. Watt was employed at the time by the University of Glasgow as a skilled craftsman making scientific instruments. The Scottish universities were pioneers in practical technical education, and in 1763, Watt was called on to repair a Newcomen engine being used in a physics course. After a series of observations, Watt saw that the Newcomen engine's waste of energy could be reduced by adding a separate condenser. This splendid invention, patented in 1769, greatly increased the efficiency of the steam engine. To invent something in a laboratory is one thing. To make it a practical success is quite another. Watt needed skilled workers, precision parts, and capital, and the relatively advanced nature of the British economy proved essential. A partnership in 1775 with Matthew Boulton, a wealthy English industrialist, provided Watt with adequate capital and exceptional skills in salesmanship that equaled those of the renowned pottery king, Josiah Wedgwood. In the craft tradition of locksmiths, tinsmiths, and millwrights, Watt found skilled mechanics who could install, regulate, and repair his sophisticated engines. From ingenious manufacturers such as the cannon maker John Wilkinson, Watt was gradually able to purchase precision parts. This support allowed him to create an effective vacuum and regulate a complex engine. In more than 20 years of constant effort, Watt made many further improvements. By the late 1780s, the firm of Boulton and Watt had made the steam engine a practical and commercial success in Britain. The steam engine of Watt and his followers was the Industrial Revolution's most fundamental advance in technology. For the first time in history, humanity had, at least for a few generations, almost unlimited power at its disposal. For the first time, inventors and engineers could devise and implement all kinds of power equipment to aid people in their work. For the first time, abundance was at least a possibility for ordinary men and women. The steam engine was quickly put to use in several industries in Britain. It drained mines and made possible the production of ever more coal to feed steam engines elsewhere. Steam power began to replace water power in the cotton spinning mills during the 1780s, contributing greatly to that industry's phenomenal rise. Steam also took the place of water power in flour mills, in the malt mills used in breweries, in the flint mills supplying the pottery industry, and in the mills exported by Britain to the West Indies to crush sugarcane. Steam power promoted important breakthroughs in other industries. The British iron industry was radically transformed. The use of powerful steam-driven bellows in blast furnaces helped ironmakers switch over rapidly from limited charcoal to unlimited coke, made from coal in the smelting of pig iron after 1770. In the 1780s, Henry Cort developed the puddling furnace, which allowed pig iron to be refined in turn with coke. Strong, skilled ironworkers, the puddlers, cooked molten pig iron in a great vat, raking off globs of refined iron for further processing. Cort also developed heavy-duty steam-powered rolling mills, capable of producing finished iron in every shape and form. The economic consequence of these technical innovations was a great boom in the British iron industry. In 1740, annual British iron production was only 17,000 tons. With the spread of coke smelting and the impact of Cort's inventions, production had reached 260,000 tons by 1806. In 1844, Britain produced 3 million tons of iron. Once scarce and expensive, iron became the cheap, basic, indispensable building block of the economy. The coming of the railroads. The second half of the 18th century saw extensive construction of hard and relatively smooth roads, particularly in France before the Revolution. Yet, it was passenger traffic that benefited most from this construction. Overland shipment of freight relying solely on horsepower was still quite limited and frightfully expensive. Shippers used rivers and canals for heavy freight whenever possible. It was logical, therefore, that inventors would try to use steam power. As early as 1800, an American drove a steamer on wheels through city streets. Other experiments followed. In the 1820s, English engineers created steam cars capable of carrying 14 passengers at 10 miles an hour, as fast as the mail coach. But the noisy, heavy steam automobiles frightened passing horses and damaged themselves as well as the roads with their vibrations. For the rest of the century, horses continued to reign on highways and city streets. The coal industry had long been using plank roads and rails to move coal wagons within mines and at the surface. Rails reduced friction and allowed a horse or a human being to pull a heavier load. Thus, once a rail capable of supporting a heavy locomotive was developed in 1816, all sorts of experiments with steam engines on rails went forward. In 1825, after 10 years of work, George Stephenson built an effective locomotive. In 1830, his rocket sped down the track of the just completed Liverpool and Manchester Railway at 16 miles per hour. The first line from Liverpool to Manchester was a financial as well as a technical success, and many private companies were quickly organized to build more rail lines. Within 20 years, they had completed the main trunk lines of Great Britain. Other countries were quick to follow. The significance of the railroad was tremendous. It dramatically reduced the cost and uncertainty of shipping freight over land. This advance had many economic consequences. Previously, markets had tended to be small and local. As the barrier of high transportation costs was lowered, markets became larger and even nationwide. Larger markets encouraged larger factories with more sophisticated machinery in a growing number of industries. Such factories could make goods more cheaply and gradually subjected most cottage workers and many urban artisans to severe competitive pressures. In all countries, the construction of railroads created a strong demand for unskilled labor and contributed to the growth of a class of urban workers. Hard work on construction gangs was done in the open air with animals and hand tools. Many landless farm laborers and poor peasants, long accustomed to leaving their villages for temporary employment, went to build railroads. By the time the work was finished, life back home in the village often seemed dull and unappealing, and many men drifted to towns in search of work. By the time they sent for their wives and sweethearts to join them, they had become urban workers. The railroad changed the outlook and values of the entire society. The last and culminating invention of the Industrial Revolution, the railroad dramatically revealed the power and increased the speed of the new age. Racing down a track at 16 miles per hour, or by 1850, at a phenomenal 50 miles per hour, was a new and awesome experience. As a French economist put it after a ride on the Liverpool and Manchester in 1833, there are certain impressions that one cannot put into words. Some great painters, notably Joseph M. W. Turner, and engineers such as Isambard Kingdom Brunel and Thomas Brassey, whose tunnels pierced mountains and whose bridges spanned valleys, became public idols, the astronauts of their day. Everyday speech absorbed the images of railroading. After you got up a full head of steam, you highballed along. And if you didn't go off the track, you might toot your own whistle. The railroad fired the imagination. Industry and population. In 1851, London hosted a famous industrial fair called the Great Exhibition in the newly built Crystal Palace, an architectural masterpiece that helped draw millions of visitors. For the visiting multitude, one fact stood out. The little island of Britain was the workshop of the world. Britain alone produced 2/3 of the world's coal and more than 1/2 of its iron and cotton cloth. More generally, it has been carefully estimated that in 1860, Britain produced a truly remarkable 20% of the entire world's output of industrial goods, whereas it had produced only about 2% of the world total in 1750. Experiencing revolutionary industrial change, Britain became the first industrial nation. As the British economy significantly increased its production of manufactured goods, the gross national product, GNP, rose roughly fourfold at constant prices between 1780 and 1851. In other words, the British people as a whole increased their wealth and their national income dramatically. At the same time, the population of Britain boomed, growing from about 9 million in 1780 to almost 21 million in 1851. Thus, growing numbers consumed much of the increase in total production. According to one important study, average consumption per person increased by only 75% between 1780 and 1851, as the growth in the total population ate up a large part of the fourfold increase in GNP in those years. Although the question is still debated, many economic historians now believe that rapid population growth in Great Britain was not harmful because it facilitated industrial expansion. More people meant a more mobile labor force, with a wealth of young workers in need of employment and ready to go where the jobs were. Contemporaries were much less optimistic. In his famous and influential essay on the principle of population, 1798, Thomas Malthus, 1766 to 1834, examined the dynamics of human populations. He argued that there are few states in which there is not a constant effort in the population to increase beyond the means of subsistence. This constant effort as constantly tends to subject the lower classes of society to distress and to prevent any great permanent amelioration of these conditions. Since, in his opinion, population would always tend to grow faster than the food supply, Malthus concluded that the only hope of warding off such positive checks to population growth as war, famine, and disease was prudential restraint. That is, young men and women had to limit the growth of population by the old tried and true means of marrying late in life. But Malthus was not optimistic about this possibility. The powerful attraction of the sexes would cause most people to marry early and have many children. Wealthy English stockbroker and leading economist David Ricardo, 1772 to 1823, coldly spelled out the pessimistic implications of Malthus's thought. Ricardo's depressing iron law of wages posited that because of the pressure of population growth, wages would always sink to subsistence level. That is, wages would be just high enough to keep workers from starving. With Malthus and Ricardo setting the tone, economics was soon dubbed the dismal science. Malthus, Ricardo, and their many followers were proved wrong in the long run. However, until the 1820s or even the 1840s, contemporary observers might reasonably have concluded that the economy and the total population were racing neck and neck, with the outcome very much in doubt. The closeness of the race added to the difficulties inherent in the journey toward industrial civilization. There was another problem as well. Perhaps workers, farmers, and ordinary people did not get their rightful share of the new wealth. Perhaps only the rich got richer, while the poor got poorer or made no progress. We will turn to this great issue after looking at the process of industrialization in continental countries.